So how did I get into ham radio? Well, to put it quite succinctly, I've always been a nerd. And this kind of is not a shock to a lot of people, but a lot of people would not even realize how much of an influence amateur radio has had in my life and my career and other things. So when I was little, probably I think in the 1980s sometime, my dad bought a Commodore 64. Actually, one of his friends brought it back from one of his trips to the United States. So you know I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, and it's a beautiful country in the tropical Caribbean, but the thing is we don't have a lot of tech. We don't have a lot of high tech available for people. So usually go to the United States and you go to other countries. People used to go to Venezuela to buy stuff too, believe it or not, because a lot of things simply weren't available. And with the restrictions on foreign exchange and stuff to get US dollars, it was even more difficult. Anyway, one of my dad's friends bought a Commodore 64 and a 1541 disk drive, and that was the beginning of it all. My dad spent a lot of time typing in programs from Compute Magazine late at night, saving them on the disk drive, of course, because we didn't want to spend more time typing in programs. But then I would get into the act. I started programming too. There are a few books. You know, I met Jim Butterfield when I was like 6 years old, and that was really nice. And, you know, he autographed one of my old Commodore magazines. Really nice person from the Toronto Commodore users group, I believe, TPUG or something. And that kind of like stuck with me. So I got involved in the C64. I got involved in electronics, radio electronics. My dad was a shortwave listener too, and we listened to the BBC, the Voice of America. We listened to All India Radio and a lot of others, and I got HCJB was one too. And a lot of these other broadcasters, and they've been really, really influential. So I listened to them and I began to see how I could pick up far signals. We threw up wires in the trees, you know, and I'll explain how that kind of is a little nostalgic, but we put up wires in the trees and we received greater signals. My dad bought a set of CB radios when my mom was a nurse. She was working in the night shift, and we kind of used that. That never really caught on with me because, I mean, my uncle was a big time CBer. He had a hardware store, my late uncle, and he used to have his CB radios in his trucks, and he had a base CB radio at his house, and he used it for that purpose, and he also used it to talk. He had a real fancy one. He had a Cobra 148 GTL with single sideband and such, and he would be able to go really far. Of course, I think he had an illegal amplifier and such too, but nobody really caught on. Anyway, that never really had much of an influence in me though. It kind of probably did a little bit, but I don't think I really remember too much of playing with the CB radios. But I do remember when I got into high school, secondary school, I met a teacher by the name of Mr. Tony Limac, 9 Yankee 4 Alpha Lima. And he was pretty interesting. He was electronics, well, he was an electronics enthusiast, but he was a music teacher and an English teacher. And you would think that, well, you know, that doesn't really have a lot to do with ham radio because a lot of ham radio is tech. But you know something? I was watching an old episode of Batman the other day, right? You know, Adam West, Batman, precisely Robin. And they had where they were going against a villain. I think it might have been not Archer, but the other villain who played musical instruments. But the thing about him, he was very skilled with technology. And that's where I really fell in love with amateur radio. So I began to get involved more in amateur radio. Of course, my school studies came first. And then when I was like, I think I was in the late 90s when I finished high school, I got my license, 1997. In Trinidad and Tobago, it was very difficult to get an amateur radio license. You have to study the UK City and Guilds radio exam, which doesn't exist anymore. It was about £60 UK, and so the local Trinidad and Tobago Amateur Radio Society would collect about 500 TT dollars for it. So yeah, you save up your allowance and then you go take the exam. It's offered once to twice per year. So if you fail once, you don't get to take it again right away. Not like the US. So I passed the exam and I got my first license. Well, actually, I didn't get my first license right away. It came 6 months later. The certificate from City and Guilds, it was received, and then, you know, Mr. Lee Mac Tony, he was like, congratulations, you got your certificate. Now you're going to apply for a license. And then he said, well, do you want to learn Morse code? I was like, yeah, why not? So back in Trinidad, we had 2 options for a license. One of them with Morse code, one of them without Morse code. They're pretty much identical in privileges, except the license without Morse code theoretically doesn't allow you to use Morse code on the air. What a novel concept. I went with the full intention of taking the Morse code exam at the telecommunications office in Port of Spain. You spend $12 in taxi fare. You spend, I don't know how much for lunch. Probably about $10 or $12. On top of that, you have to go and sit and wait in some bureaucrat's office. So I went and I did that. And then when I went up, the officer was Bal Gones 9Y4 Bravo Golf. He went and he said, well, your Morse code examiner called and said he wouldn't show up. Would you like to take a codeless license? I was like, you might as well have told me, why don't you go jump in a lake? Well, I took the codeless license because what was I going to do? Was I just going to go back and waste more money and come back next time? No. So I did. So I did that. I got my license, and then I operated the first call sign. I had a 9 Zulu 4 call sign. I made contact with 9Y4 Fox Papa, Fitzroy Peters. He was a really friendly person. He was always on the local repeaters. So I had a little handheld radio. I bought a Kenwood TH7 from Arnold 9Y4 November Golf, and I brought it with me in my bag. I got out in the town square in Independence Square, and I went and I called. I said QRZ, and then I said my call sign, and then 9Y4 Fox Papa came up to me and he was like, well, welcome to the hobby. So Fitzroy and we got along really good. We would communicate keyboard to keyboard on packet radio later on, and we would also do a lot of talking on the local repeater. Of course, he became Silent Key, and he will be missed. So that is the story briefly of how I got into amateur radio. By the way, I did go back and take my Morse code test, and I got my 9 Yankee 4 license, 9 Yankee 4 Romeo Alpha Juliet, and then I went and I pretty much, the rest was history.